The Dynamic Learning Maps Alternate Assessment System is a new assessment designed to more validly measure what students with significant cognitive disabilities know and can do. This presentation will provide information about an approach to text comprehension instruction for students with significant cognitive disabilities. This training, Teaching Text Comprehension, Anchor Read Apply, is one of a series that supports teachers of students with significant cognitive disabilities in their efforts to teach and assess more effectively. Sponsored by a grant from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, this training is part of the professional development efforts of the Dynamic Learning Maps Alternate Assessment Consortium. Text comprehension is a complex activity that presents challenges to learners of all types, but it can be overwhelming for students with significant cognitive disabilities. It involves understanding the words, processing them, remembering them, and constructing meaning across the entire text. We are using the term text comprehension to encompass both reading comprehension and listening comprehension. Both reading and listening comprehension are forms of text comprehension. Both require students to understand the words, process them, remember them, and construct meaning across the entire text. Reading comprehension is different from listening comprehension in that it also requires students to decode or identify the words. Text comprehension can happen when students read or listen. When text comprehension takes the form of reading comprehension, the student can read the text silently or orally. In either case, reading comprehension requires readers to identify and understand the words, process them, remember them, and construct understandings across the entire text. When text comprehension takes the form of listening comprehension, the student can follow along with the text or just listen. In either case, listening comprehension requires the listener to understand the words, process them, remember them, and construct understandings across the entire text. The primary difference between listening and reading comprehension is that reading comprehension requires students to identify or decode the words, and listening comprehension does not. Oftentimes, we make efforts to compensate for the challenges students face by teaching them the content of the text without teaching them to actually read or listen and extract meaning from it. Alternatively, we teach them to search the text to find specific information or responses rather than teaching them to process the text. The differences may sound minor, but the differences are critical if we want students to learn to independently read or listen and comprehend text. Teaching students the content of a text certainly helps them learn the information, but it does not teach them the underlying skills they need to independently comprehend text in the future. One way we teach the important underlying skills involved in text comprehension is an approach we call Anchor Read Apply. This instructional approach supports students in learning how to activate background knowledge based on prior experience or build new background knowledge that they can connect to information contained in or related to the text. Because it emphasizes teaching students to activate or use existing background knowledge or ways of thinking, it is a strategy that promotes independent text comprehension from the very beginning. The anchor portion of the Anchor Read Apply lesson has two components. It begins with a short activity that is completed prior to reading that helps students connect what they know or have experienced to the specific purpose for reading. This step either involves activating background knowledge or ways of thinking students already know, or teaching them new knowledge that is required to understand the text. During this part, we are setting an anchor that focuses student attention and prepares them for ways they need to think to effectively construct meaning from the text. The second part of the anchor step involves clearly stating a specific purpose for listening or reading. In DLM, these purposes should link directly to essential elements in reading literature, reading information text, or language. At each grade level, there are a limited number of purposes that are important to address. Many purposes, such as those that focus on reading to remember details, apply to almost every text. Other purposes, such as reading to sequence events, only apply to texts that have a meaningful sequence. While not all purposes apply to every text, it is the case that every text can be read for more than one purpose. Knowing what the purpose is for reading on any given day is important because it guides the selection of an appropriate anchor activity. If, for example, the purpose for reading is to determine what happens in the beginning, middle, and end of a story, then the anchor activity can help students activate what they already know about things that happen at the beginning, middle, and end of their school day, a favorite movie, or some other event. If the purpose is to determine how a character responds to a challenge in a story, then the anchor activity could help students recall a challenge in their own lives and how they responded. Alternatively, the anchor activity could require them to recall a challenge faced by a character in another book that they already read for multiple purposes in the past. Importantly, the anchor activity does not typically focus on teaching new content. Certainly, there will be times when you need to introduce new vocabulary words or help students gain enough background knowledge related to the content of the book that they aren't lost. But the anchor activity is not intended to teach students the content of the book. This likely sounds quite different from other approaches to comprehension instruction you've heard in the past. It is absolutely the case that readers require background knowledge to read a text with comprehension. However, the knowledge that is required is not always content specific. Take, for example, a lesson that addresses the third grade essential element in reading literature. This essential element reads, determine the beginning, middle, and end of a familiar story with a logical order. The classic children's book, The Little Red Hen, provides a great text for addressing this essential element. Primary grades teachers across the country use some version of this story to teach children about sequencing. The story has such a logical, linear sequence. The hen plants the wheat, no one will help. The hen harvests the wheat, no one will help. The hen mills the wheat, no one will help. And so the story goes until the hen has baked the bread. Then all of the other animals want to help her eat it, but she eats it by herself. A more traditional approach to building background knowledge for this book might focus on the farm, farm animals, or the process for growing wheat, milling it, and making bread. However, none of these bits of information is particularly important if your purpose for reading is to sequence the events in the story. If students are supposed to sequence the events, the teacher must plan an anchor activity that helps them remember that they know something about sequence. Many teachers of students with significant cognitive disabilities help students think about sequencing by referencing the daily schedule. Because we use the schedule every day and often ask things like, what comes next? The schedule provides students with some understanding of sequencing, whether or not they realize it. They may not know what it means to sequence, and they may still be learning the meaning of words like before and after or beginning, middle, and end. However, they know that the things they do at school happen in a certain order. In fact, many students demand that we stick to the order. They have internalized it so well. For beginners, you may just want to stick with beginning and end. You could ask students to use the schedule to identify what happens at the beginning and then the end of the school day. Or you can just give them 2 cards without the rest of the schedule and ask, what happens at the beginning of our day? You might follow with, what happens first? In future lessons, you might use this anchor activity to move students towards more complex ways of thinking about texts. You could add an event from the middle of the day. Anchoring the lesson about the little red hen with this activity helps students understand that they know what happens at the beginning, middle, end of the school day, and that this understanding will help them as they read for the purpose of identifying what happens at the beginning, middle, and end of the little red hen. Pause for activity 1. As another example, Consider a lesson that addresses a 7th grade essential element in reading information text. The essential element is determine how a fact, step, or event fits into the overall structure of the text. A social story is one of many types of text that could be used to address this essential element. While it's called a social story, which would imply that the text is literature, the point of a social story is to teach individuals with autism and other disabilities about social communication, interaction, and behavioral expectations. As such, the texts are informative or information texts. This particular social story was written to help a student learn what to expect and how to behave when going to the movies. It includes all of the steps from arriving to selecting a movie, buying treats, finding a seat, all the way to leaving the theater. The overall structure of this book is a step-by-step how-to. As an anchor activity, teachers could provide students with 3 or more steps about a familiar activity and ask students to tell them how these steps relate to the overall activity. An anchor activity like this will provide students with a familiar anchor to use when reading Going to the Movies for the purpose of deciding how 1 or more steps fit in the entire book. After an appropriate anchor activity and a clear statement of the purpose, the teacher and students read the text, keeping the purpose in mind. Students can work on comprehension through reading or listening. In fact, this reading can be independent, with a partner, computer-supported, or read aloud. But the reading is uninterrupted as students remember the text and think about the purpose. Once reading is completed, the students get a chance to apply what they have learned as they engage in a group task that is directly related to the purpose for reading. The tasks are usually quite short and are intended simply as a check to ensure that students have successfully achieved the purpose. After completing the task, the teacher provides feedback, which includes referencing the text to either confirm student responses or provide an opportunity to reconsider an answer. Each component of the Anchor Read Apply lesson is critical to improving text comprehension. Comprehension requires the reader to know how to draw upon their existing knowledge, skills, and experiences to construct understandings from the text. Having a clearly stated purpose focuses the reader on the most important information during instruction. Completing a clearly linked task helps readers apply what they have learned so that they can get informative feedback that will further increase their independence and success the next time they are trying to comprehend a text. All too often, educators focus on comprehension questions as the way they address text comprehension. We can absolutely use questions to assess how well a student understands a text, but questions we generate do little to teach students to construct their own understandings of text. There is a research-based approach to teaching comprehension called reciprocal questioning. It effectively builds comprehension skills, but it requires the student to generate questions while reading, not just answer the questions we pose. If we're going to teach students with significant cognitive disabilities to comprehend text, we need to have instruction that teaches them to construct understandings so that they can eventually respond to questions. We can't start by asking the questions. Searching for or looking back to find answers is another strategy that is commonly used to compensate when reading with comprehension is too hard. Instead of asking students to read or listen to comprehend the entire text, or even a section of it, we ask them to read to find particular information, or teach them to read the question and look for the answer in the text. This is a useful test-taking strategy. Most successful test takers read the questions and then look for the answers, but this is not the same thing as comprehension. When readers are allowed to look back to find information that is required to answer a question, they are using verbal problem-solving skills to compensate for a lack of text comprehension. Our goal is to teach text comprehension. Over time, we want students to learn to read or listen, to remember, process, and construct understandings. We'll teach them to look back at the text to confirm those understandings, but we'll ask them to read, remember, and complete the apply task before going back to check their responses for accuracy and completeness. In the Anchor Read Apply framework, we teach students to use the text after they have completed the task in the Apply step. Remember that the Apply step includes an after-reading task that is directly related to the purpose that was set before reading. After completing the task, the teacher provides feedback and guides the students in looking back to the text to check their responses. They check to make sure the responses they gave were correct, and they check to make sure they didn't forget anything. In the module on selecting purposes for comprehension, you can learn more about using the DLM essential elements to select purposes for reading and match them with anchor activities and apply tasks to support students as they work on ELA Claim 1. Students will comprehend text in increasingly complex ways. Pause for Activity 2. For more information about text comprehension instruction and the Dynamic Learning Maps Alternate Assessment System, please go to dynamiclearningmaps.org. Thank you for your participation.